Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, April the 21st. Today, the fight back of the Mandarins as Olly Robbins gives his evidence. But in reality, is that the second most important event going on in Westminster today? I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News, or maybe even the third biggest story. The front page of the Times called Olly Robbins' Evidence to Come blockbuster. I'm just not quite sure that's his style or that's his goal. And this isn't meant unkindly, but Olly Robbins has had a stellar career shutting things down, not blowing them up. And it's not clear that he is, and his goal is to bring down the government. It's more to clear his name and have a little bit of a sense of natural justice about his own reputation. Number 10 were pretty happy with yesterday. So I'm going to say that we're at the stage of the story with Mandelson and his vetting where it would take something big, new and sparkly to get this whole thing up and running again.
And lest we forget, there is politics as usual in the midst of the reputation tussle between Sir Keir and Sir Humphrey, aka Ollie Robbins. And the government is having its hand forced in the Commons. It's been forced to accept a ban on smartphones in schools as the price of getting through key legislation. Keir Starmer has resisted calls for this for months, but finally conceded in the Lords yesterday to avoid more ping pong.
Yeah, listeners to this podcast will know that I've been going on for over a week about how important the next sort of week or so, these 2 weeks are. It's called wash up before prorogation, and apologies for the technical terms, but it's basically the end of the parliamentary year. And what's going to happen is the government has got to either get through all the stages in the Commons or carry over or accept the death of the remaining 15 active bits of government legislation. Now, prorogation is probably a week tomorrow, which incidentally avoids the final Prime Minister's questions. But that 15 is a big number. Thursday is the courts bill. The government's backing themselves to face down a troublesome amendment from Charlotte Nichols. But expect these sudden policy sort of concessions to be a feature of the next not many days, 5 sitting days between now and next Wednesday.
Interesting. And the other big event in Westminster is Labour discussing its future at a big conference. That's from the Good Growth Foundation, headed by Praful Nagran, quite close to Labour, at least adjacent, is holding its national growth debate. It looks a bit like a political economy song contest, really. It's got a lot of the biggest figures around Labour and centrist politics sharing their vision for revival. It feels like they're slightly going toe-to-toe on what to do about the sagging UK growth outlook, Sam.
Yeah, Labour's own version of Eurovision, but not much Euro, and maybe a little bit of vision, but not that much. And no Keir Starmer. I think that's actually one of the reasons why it's so important, maybe even more important than the Robbins event. Because I was talking yesterday to one of the people that's taking part in this conference, and they said that this is the event where everyone positions for a post-Starmer world. So whilst the Robbins event doesn't sort of kill this government, it probably does sort of rot it a little bit, it further, the real debate inside Labour is where next, not just who next, but sort of where they go in policy terms. And this is Labour auditioning ideas as well as faces. Has to be said, I'm sure cabinet members would not in public accept that characterisation. You know, Ed Miliband's doing a big set piece speech. He will claim loyalty. Rachel Reeves definitely would claim loyalty. She's also there today. But there are all sorts that quite interesting groupings getting together. Like there's the leaders of the Growth Group and the Tribune Group, sort of representing different wings of the Labour Party. And there's also an onstage conversation with the gloriously titled Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, who is being interviewed by one Anne McElvoy, which will be before lunch. I was thinking of coming along, Anne, and sitting in the front row. Is that okay?
I'll see what I can do, Sam. You could bring the popcorn. Ed Miliband also speaking there. Yes, before I talk to Darren Jones, who's been a bit of a Praetorian Guard for the Prime Minister. So it'll be interesting how he rolls on that. But the Energy Secretary, Sam, is going to double down on his core message, setting out how global instability that we've seen play out in the Gulf is once again exposing the cost of dependence on fossil fuels and why he thinks clean, homegrown power is the only route to energy security and to bringing down bills in the long term. And what struck me is this passage from what I think he's going to say. The era of fossil fuel security is over. The era of clean energy security must come of age. Now, this is a very different emphasis from the Prime Minister himself, and I think the Chancellor has aligned herself more on the Prime Minister side of this, saying oil and gas will be part of the mix for some time to come. This is a transition. There are no principled objections to drilling and to exploration in the North Sea. Well, the Energy Secretary, it seems to have his foot somewhere completely different on different accelerator, which is double down, not back down. And that repeated use of this phrase, clean energy, which basically evinces this target of really advancing that by 2030, that really does divide the tribes. There's been a lot of pushback to that from the Tony Blair Institute, endorsed by Tony Blair himself, saying this is not realistic in the world that we're now in. And that's this big argument. Do you go very, very fast ahead, as Ed Miliband is suggesting, or do you take a slightly more cautious and transitional view of how you get off fossil fuels dependency and all the geopolitics that brings with it?
That's right. Last week, Rachel Reeves talked about the government desire for delinking the gas and electricity price, something that's hurt us in previous crises. I think that an announcement around that is expected from Ed Miliband too. Guardian had a bit of a preview. It wasn't formally briefed. They were suggesting the UK would increase taxes on wind and solar farms in a bid to push them onto so-called fixed price contracts. Let's hear more of that and then see what the analysts say. Although not just the analysts whose response matters.
There's always a bit of a political backlash too, and a lot to listen out for with our bat ears for Labour future power struggles, where we've got these different factions represented. We've got Chris Curtis, the head of the growth group of Labour MPs. Also Louise Haigh, the ex-cabinet minister, head of the Tribune group, on a panel first thing this morning. They've written a joint article. And what's interesting is the overlap on subjects from devolution to tax reform to deregulation. And drumroll, it's back again. Welfare reform.
Yeah, the fact that they both alighted on welfare reform, the kind of representatives of the two wings of the Labour Party, it is really striking. The government pushing to get it back on the agenda. Somebody very senior in government, sort of, who's got a big role in the area of welfare reform, was bemoaning to a Labour MP that whilst they want to do it, they just don't know where Keir Starmer is on the subject. And I think that tells you a lot about the problems with this government. They can't read the Prime Minister. But there's another bit of what's going to be said at this conference that has piqued my attention, and it's to do with a core subject that we always talk about on this podcast, political economy, and in particular fiscal rules, because I've seen a preview of Louise Haig's remarks that she's going to give on the panel this morning. And what she says represents the view of quite a lot of Labour MPs. And so there's a decent chance that if there's a change of leader and chancellor, there's an overhaul. Right, let me just set out what Louise will say. She absolutely acknowledges that debt is now close to 100% of GDP. Borrowing costs are sky high. To pretend otherwise is nothing short of deceitful. The idea that there's a lot of room for manoeuvre. But she says there are still massive problems in Britain, weak growth and so on. And governments have got to look again at the frameworks that they create to try and promote growth. And here she goes, and it's a tweak to the Office for Budget Responsibility. She says we need to look at the way the OBR assess policy by favouring short-term costs over long-term gains, to the way the Treasury operates, and to the obsession with fiscal headroom over all other measures of our economic health in our economic debate. She makes clear that is a problem. So the message: a fiscally responsible overhaul of the OBR and the Treasury. I think that's a really big, bold pitch. And the question will be, do the markets believe that? And do the wider political community believe that? What do you think, Anne?
Well, what I take from that is really fascinating listening to your read out there. It's just the sheer ambition of Louise Haigh. I mean, I think she was having had that relatively short stint as transport secretary, and then slightly luckless, they kind of oust her over something, that she tripped over in her own past. There was a bit of a sense, well, this is this kind of soft left noises off, but it just really strikes me listening to what you're saying that this is pretty serious. There's a lot of thought that's gone into it. Whether a fiscally responsible overhaul of the OBR is actually anything like as easy to deliver with reliable outcomes as a few words like that make it sound, well, you can have some doubts about that. But I'm just sort of struck by the fact that she clearly sort of intends to go somewhere in the future of the Labour debate. There are quite a lot of old favourites here, aren't there? The country has prioritised short-term consolidation over long-term growth. But it's really more of a kind of snapshot description of what's wrong than a very clear recipe, other than messing around with headroom, which probably, in fairness, the Chancellor may have wished she'd left herself a bit more creative accounting on that score. But I only point out, just having spoken to an asset manager who was comparing the UK outlook with some other countries and what is investable at the moment, what isn't, that there's still a big recipe for change in the UK. I doubt a lot of people may not be as convinced that you can simply sort it out there by challenging the OBR and giving yourself a bit more leeway.
I think that's right. I think you've highlighted on exactly the right point. If there is a change of leader, or even if there isn't, how much can Labour change course policy-wise midway through the Parliament? How much can it change economic policy, fiscal policy, borrowing policy without a public mandate? I think that's a really, really interesting question. And actually conferences like the one today are quite important to give us a preview. So as I say, I think the market, I think analysts will be paying quite a lot of attention to what's going on in Westminster there. Right, voting intention, the weekly YouGov Sky Times voting intention. Reform are back on top even further. They're up 3 on 27%. The Tories are on 17, down 2. The Greens are on 17, down 1. Labour on 16, down 1. The Lib Dems on 13. I know that Reform are pretty happy actually to be back on 27. I'd caution that dips can go up. You can have a dip one week and a rise the next, and actually it's just all within the margin of error. So let's see whether it holds over a period of time. Knowledge is on his 7th week of touring the country yesterday in Dudley, Sandwell and Walsall. So they are areas that Reform are clearly looking at. Labour, again, in the doldrums behind the Greens. I don't think this morning and all the events of today will particularly help, though.
And Reform, pretty confident, I think, from some conversations I had in the last few days going into the elections in May, and hoping that they can really visibly gouge out Labour areas, take that fight to Labour as well as any collateral damage it might do to the Tories. Let's see. Right, Olly Robbins set to appear this morning. Drop intro on that one. Anyway, he's going to give his side of events. The now ex, or at least has been sacked, permanent secretary at the Foreign Office. He'll face Emily Thornberry and the rest of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee gang at 9 a.m. Have you got any sense what his defence is going to look like, Sam?
Well, I think really ever since Thursday night, we've been reporting kind of what the case for the defence of Olly Robbins is. Last week we were talking to friends, and so I think we have a pretty good sense of where he's going to land. I suspect he will make clear what is visible from space, which is that the vetting was all done in an atmosphere where there was no expectation that any result of the vetting would lead to the appointment being unpicked. That's obviously direct contradiction to what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday. People will have to judge whether or not they remember the period in question and what it felt like at the time. But the point is, Peter Mandelson's appointment had been announced. It would have been quite tricky to unpick it, but Keir Starmer says he would have done. I think that Olly Robbins is also likely to be asked about, what was the attitude to vetting at the time. Well, that's where the story that I did yesterday sort of comes in. Simon Case formally advised Keir Starmer to do the vetting before he made the announcement, and Keir Starmer basically decided to ignore that, override that, and do the announcement first, and then the vetting. And I think, that might point to a somewhat dismissive attitude towards vetting. And I wouldn't be surprised if Olly Robbins reflected that. And also, there's been this sort of thing I've been, reporting since Friday, which is I do think that they quibble. And this is very, very Mandarin process, which is code for boring. But he would reject the characterization that the UK's Security Vetting Authority gave a recommendation which he overturned. There's just a bunch of civil servants, Robbins included, that says that's not how it worked. It was his decision only. It was for him to do what he wanted. That's why he couldn't talk about any of the inputs into his decision, and he did the right thing. And that Keir Starmer and Dennis are effectively completely mischaracterizing how it works. So I think that'll be the nub of it. But as I said at the top, it's all about, does he say something big, new and shiny to sort of move the debate on? Because right now it feels to me like this whole debate is drowning in process. And I do slightly politically wonder whether that isn't in both sides' interests.
And amid all of this dense processology, which we all became instant experts in yesterday, watching the Prime Minister, can Olly Robbins really show that he was essentially being pushed by Keir Starmer or by Number 10, by members of the team? And I think at this point, it would need to be pretty specific to wave through the Mandelson appointment come what may. Now, Playbook is pointing out this morning that this is what Robbins' allies euphemistically describe as the prevailing atmosphere argument. And that, I think, as you're hinting, that may be convincing to people who understand how civil servants work and want to say, you should imagine the pressure we were under here to expedite this. But then Olly Robbins has got to come out and say it. He can't haver around in this way, which I think we've seen quite a lot of the language in this has been a bit like that. Funny enough, I was talking to an old friend or an old student friend of Robbins from his days in the Oxford Union, and saying, he was really, really very good at everything he did. It's just the small p politics seemed to slightly bemuse him. And I think there's quite a lot of small p politics that have just got big here, and he has to sort of be aware of that. But in the end, it depends how he wants to defend himself, and will he also be able to nail his point that he only got information about that vetting decision verbally. And in a sense, what difference does that make? As you point out, it's going to have to be pretty conclusive, I think, to make his point that the Prime Minister is more to blame than he is in the detail.
Okay, so at this point, I'm still going to stick to my bold prediction that it's in everybody's interest that this goes away. But whether it does go away rather depends on when the next tranche of documents is coming, because we've got a mega release of all the information related to Peter Mandelson's appointment, possibly now not this side of the May elections. But more critically, there's sort of questions about whether we get everything that we were promised, or whether or not the Intelligence and Security Committee is able to withhold a little bit more than perhaps had been at one point anticipated?
I've got really fascinated by this exactly, Sam, because if you remember, the whole reason that the ISC was supposed to be looking after this major document release we were promised in the wake of the Epstein files opening up, which of course unleashed the whole can of worms about Peter Mandelson. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for that. Well, it was suggested that this was supposed to, and particularly after that humble address, that dramatic encounter in Parliament, that we'd pretty much get everything relating to Peter Mandelson's communications, sort of except what was explicitly ruled out on security grounds. Well, Dan Bloom and Sam Blewett, together at Politico, have had a dig around and seeing where the ISC are now. And that seems to be in a slightly different place, which is saying that anything that would come under the scope of prejudicing foreign relations could be redacted, even if it was not on security grounds. Now, that's a bit closer to the original position of what Number 10 wanted to block. So I think we ought to be a bit vigilant there. That there seems to be this.
Oh, God, they took that language out. No. They absolutely took that language out of the motion. That MPs rejected the idea that anything should be withheld on foreign relation grounds. So you're saying that the various mandarins are just sort of ignoring that?
Well, yeah, it's not even just the mandarins. This is the issue, I think, goes back to the ISC. It's well worth reading this piece by my Politico colleagues, because it's still as far as I understand it, the ISC broadly intends to redact comments it deems prejudicial to foreign relations. And this is per a number of sources involved in the live process. But I mean, I think you've just put your finger on it. Why then is this different from what number 10 was defeated on, which was supposed to be that would be a much broader release of information? There has to be some way to prevent diplomatic discussions being published. It seems to be the new line. Well, that was exactly what was pushed back against. And also, I think everybody knows Peter Mandelson's pretty free with his thoughts, and he was going to have some salty things to say. And it comes down really to relations with Donald Trump. I do slightly predict a riot on this one because it does seem to be been that these pledges were written in invisible ink.
Wow. Okay, that is one to bookmark, aggressively bookmark. I am surprised at that. That's a great story. And remember, this was all done with a parliamentary device known as a humble address. If you don't fulfill a humble address, that is a snub to the king. I remember that was the debate that we had last time. And all of this is done in the King's name. So, dear ISC, you might be heading to the Tower faster than you realise. We've had the alarm. We better wrap it up. Otherwise, we're for the Tower too. We will see you tomorrow after today's Tsunami of News. Have a good day.
Yeah, is it going to be Olly Robbins or Keir Starmer in the moat?